standing on the edge of that deck, towering above the water.
I remember looking at Andrea and telling her, or looking at her and seeing that look in her eyes of she had quit, she had given up. I remember her saying, "I'm scared." And I said, "It's okay to be scared. I'm scared too." She said, "What are we going to do?" I said, "We're going to burn up or we're going to jump." And she said she couldn't jump. I remember telling her, "If you don't jump, I'm going to throw you. We have to get off of here. We can't stay here."
How far is it to the sea?
Maybe 90 feet, 100 feet. It's a long ways. I remember closing my eyes and saying a prayer and asking God to tell my wife, little girl, that Daddy did everything he could. And if I survive this, it's for a reason. I made those 3 steps, and I pushed off into the rig. And I fell for what seemed like forever. A lot of things go through your mind.
Wearing a life jacket, he and Andrea jumped off the rig and fell 100 feet to the sea, went way below the water, popped up again like corks, and discovered that the sea all around them, or near them at least, was on fire. And Mike Williams thought, what have I done? At least I was dry up there, and now I'm going to burn up down here. In that moment, far in the distance, he could hear somebody yelling, "Over here! Over here!" It was a fishing boat. Fishing boats were coming from all over the Gulf because they saw what happened. They heard the radio calls, the Mayday calls, and these average Americans, these fishermen, took their boats into that and started plucking survivors out of the water, and that's how Mike Williams came to survive to tell his story on 60 Minutes. As I mentioned to you, Mike was the chief electronics engineer on the ship, and so therefore he knew a lot about how the ship worked. And what the entire country was wondering in that first week was, what went wrong? How does the safest ship in the world end up with the biggest accident in the history of drilling offshore? And so, as you may recall from those days, there were a lot of congressional hearings that were going on at that very moment. There were hearings in the Senate, there were hearings in the House. Mike had told us a lot of things in that interview on 60 Minutes that no one had ever heard before about the trouble that the rig was having in the days and weeks before the accident occurred. Well, none of these things had been told to the investigators for the Senate or the House. And finally, it came time for the Interior Secretary, Ken Salazar, who's responsible for offshore drilling in this country, to appear before the House and the Senate. He appeared that Monday, that very morning after the 60 Minutes broadcast. And here's what happened to Ken during the course of that day. And one more, Parker.
Last night I saw the rerun of the, in fact I saw it 3 times. Mike Williams on 60 Minutes, I'm sure all of you saw that.
I did not watch the 60-minute episode that you referred to.
The 60 Minutes did a piece, as is so often the case, that I thought was really interesting.
We hear from on 60 Minutes what we couldn't hear from industry witnesses.
I don't know if you had the chance to see the 60 Minutes call it expose.
I did not watch the 60-minute program.
I watched 60 Minutes on Sunday.
I did not watch it because I have been working on the Gulf incident nonstop, so
This is the Gulf incident we're talking about.
So the moral of the story is, don't miss 60 Minutes. One of the things that we've been covering on 60 Minutes a great deal is what we started this conversation with, and that is the difficult economic times that the country finds itself in. And of course, we all remember what happened in 2008 when the banking system collapsed and set us on this path for a continued recession and then the worst recovery that we've ever had. It seemed to me, with all the things that Ben Bernanke, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, was doing, all of the extraordinary efforts that the Fed was taking during the banking collapse, that it was time for the chairman of the Fed to sit down and do an interview. Now, this never happens. The chairman of the Fed traditionally does not do interviews. So I called over to the Federal Reserve and I explained our rationale to them, and the public relations guy for the chairman listened to me, and when I stopped, he laughed out loud and said, "The chairman never does interviews." Parker? And one more. We're sitting on this corner where your family store was, and I see it's Main Street.
Yes?
People feel like guys like you are tuned into what happens on Wall Street, and you forget places like this.
You know, I come from Main Street. That's my background. And I've never been on Wall Street. And I care about Wall Street for one reason and one reason only, because what happens on Wall Street matters to Main Street. And if we don't have stabilization in the financial markets, if we don't take the steps necessary to make sure that credit is flowing again, then my father couldn't get a loan to build his new store.
Does anybody here know where that Main Street is? Dillon, South Carolina. That's exactly right. Ben Bernanke, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, is from Dillon, South Carolina. He was one of those kids, you know, he was the smartest kid in town. And when he was in Dillon High School and discovered that they didn't offer calculus at Dillon High School in those days, he taught himself calculus. He was offered a position at Harvard. His mother didn't want him to go. He didn't have the clothes, she told him, to go back east and go to school in Harvard. But of course he did go to Harvard. Later became chairman of economics at Princeton, and later became the Federal Reserve chairman as nominated by President Bush. People will argue about the role of the Federal Reserve. People will have reasonable arguments about whether the Fed has done too much or not enough in this economic crisis that we're in. But let me just say this about Ben Bernanke. His academic specialty, the thing that he spent his life working on in academia, was the causes of the Great Depression. He is one of the world's leading experts on the causes of the Great Depression. And when he saw 2008 happen, he thought it was happening all over again. And so he threw $2 trillion at the crisis in that moment to provide the world banking system with enough liquidity to keep from freezing up. He was afraid that we were going to go from a really bad recession all the way into the Great Depression too. I think history is going to bear him out on this. Nobody's happy with the way the economy is now, but Chairman Bernanke, and a lot of people who understand these things better than I do, will tell you that it would be a whole lot worse. You'll recall that in 2008, the Congress was debating what to do, the President was debating what to do, all the time that the banks and the financial markets are seizing up. Ben Bernanke, on his own volition, didn't have to debate with anybody. He didn't have to get anybody to sign off on Capitol Hill. He didn't have to write a new law and get it passed. He just did it. He just picked up the phone and threw $2 trillion of liquidity at the problem in order to prevent the Great Depression too. Where did Ben Bernanke get his insight into work, what it is to work, what it is to run a business? Well, I'll show you.